It gives me really great pleasure to briefly introduce our moderator, who will introduce our two panelists. Fernando is a native son of Cuba and a friend of Perry Wohlhouse. He is the Thomas O. Boyle Lecturer in Law at the University of Pennsylvania School of Law. He also teaches courses at the Graduate School of Social Policy and Practice on topics such as U.S. immigration law, international human rights and refugee law, and nonprofit leadership. He is the winner of many awards with regard to his teaching. He's the recipient of, for example, the 2016 Law School Beacon Award, which recognizes exemplary commitment to pro bono work by a Penn Law faculty member. So Fernando, thanks so much for indulging me and for joining us today. And the floor is yours to introduce the panel and to begin our conversation. Gracias. Lo siento.
No, gracias. Gracias. Thanks to Perry Wohlhouse and Theo and Rashawn for bringing us all together. And thank you for being with us for about 45 minutes or an hour. So, you know, Cuba's gone through a lot. In the 19th century, there was a revolution overthrowing the Spanish colonial powers. Moving forward in the 60s, another revolution overthrowing Fulgencio Batista. And recently, there have been even more protests. So to bring us up to date, I'm honored and happy to introduce my colleague, who will bring us up to date as to what's been going on, giving us their perspectives from the various disciplines that they represent. So Amalia, Professor Amalia Che is an Afro-Cuban American scholar and teaches at the Graduate School of Education here at Penn. And she has lived experiences as a Cuban coming in from Mariel, the port of Mariel. And she has lived experiences in the area of education, which is what she teaches in. And her specific areas of expertise are inner city schools, community college, access to college, and so forth. She was just in Cuba over 2 years ago and studying the access and experiences of African diasporic students and communities. She travels a lot before the pandemic, going to Cuba, South Africa, and even Ferguson, Missouri. So thanks for being with us. And to her right is Professor Odette Casamayor Cisnero, also born and raised in Havana, and is associate professor of Latin American cultures here at Penn. She studies Afro-Latino American and Afro-Latinx experiences and the global African diaspora. She's the author of Utopia, Dystopia, e Ingravidez, which studies the existential experience of Cubans after the Soviet Union left. And she's now working on a new book which is provisionally called On Being Black, Self-Identification and Counter-Hegemonic Knowledge and Afro-Cuban Cultural Production. So thank you so much for being with us. So let's just start. We're gonna just ask questions about the past, the present, and the future. So Odette, you just want to bring us all up to date really quickly as to, from your perspectives, what might be socioeconomic or racial inequalities in Cuba that led to the recent protests?
Thank you very much. So I truly appreciate your invitation from the Perry Wohlhouse and of course of this wonderful presentation. And I appreciate especially your question about so how bringing us to history, because I think that we can't not understand Cuban presence without going back to history. And considering specifically racial inequalities or social inequalities in general, but racial inequalities in particular in Cuba, the fact is that we are confronting a systemic structural racism, and to understand it in the present, we have to go back to the 19th century that you were already talking about. And so the truth is that neither the 1886 abolition, the abolition of slavery in 1886, neither the republic in the institution of the republic in 1902, or the triumph of the revolution in 1959 were successful in the eradication of racial inequalities. In the 19th century, so why to go back to the 19th century, and it's considering how the idea of Cubanness has been constructed through the myth of a raceless nation. And this has been kept since Jose Marti at the end of the 19th century. Jose Marti was the leader, the main ideologue of Cuban, of the idea of the Cuban nation. And it has been kept through the Republic. So during the Republic, once, of course, all Cubans were supposed to be the same, the idea of this cohesiveness of the whole nation through the non-distinction, non-racial distinction has been enacted, as in many other countries in Latin America. It's what we know as racial democracy. And once in 1959, with the triumph of the revolution, it's true that the revolution tried at the very beginning, since 1959, they enacted many measures that sought to eradicate inequalities at all levels. And it brought, so those measures brought in general, in the 1959, they brought to Cubans, all Cubans, equal access to high quality education, high quality healthcare, culture, employment, and many other public services. But the fact is that this was kept at the same time that those measures were enacted. The revolutionary government silenced any discussion on racial inequality. And the reason enacted to that was that Cuba, a small country, was threatened at I am talking about the 60s, and even March 59, when Fidel Castro gave this speech in which he said, well, we are a small country, we are being threatened, so how it comes, we cannot now think about these kind of divisions. And the problem is that an existent problem, a problem that came through the colonial times to the present was always there and never discussed. And once we arrived in the 1990s, with the collapse of the socialist system, the Cuban government was unable to keep to guarantee all these promises, all the welfare that somehow inequality that was somehow maintained during the 70s and 80s. And at that moment, and furthermore, with all the economic reforms that were implemented in the 2000, inequalities, so especially racial inequality, they widened at that moment. And the situation right now has to be seen. I think when we are talking about racial inequalities in Cuba, we have to see it as an all-encompassing problem, as a result of a structural racism. And it's very important as well not to consider that it is an endemic problem of only Cubans on the island. Racism, Cuban racism, is throughout the Cuban community on the island and outside the island, in the diaspora as well. And also, I would suggest that we discuss these problems concerning, again, racial inequalities within an hemispheric and global context. So this is in general what I would say concerning racial inequalities.
Yeah, so thank you for that great and brief overview of the evolution of Cuba. So independence from Spain in the 1800s, the establishment of the Republic in 1902, the overthrow of Batista, Castro coming in, the myth of a raceless Cuba, but BS. And then racial inequalities that still exist in Cuba. And, Amalia, with your research on education, how does educational racial inequalities play out in Cuba, which may have resulted in the protests that we saw recently?
Sure. And I want to also kind of fill in some of the historical gaps that I know my colleague attempted to share in 5 minutes, which is actually very hard to do, to go through the colonial period, the Republic period, and the period of the Revolution. But I want to focus on the period between independence and the 1959 revolution, because what happens in Cuba is that there is this erasure of Black history. So you know how in the United States, we've been talking about critical race theory. We've been really supporting this project called 1619 coming out of the New York Times, which teaches Americans about the history of slavery in the United States. Well, in Cuba, between 1901 and 1959, there were 526 Black societies. They were called Sociedades Negras and Sociedades de Color. The director of these societies was Juan René Betancourt. And so this director was exiled when Fidel came into power because he wanted to continue these societies. And Fidel and the new regime decided that there was no longer a need for Black societies, Black organizations, and activism related to Cuba because the new revolution, the communist revolution, has eradicated racism. Of course, along Marxist lines, they focused on class, and they thought class would help eradicate racism. But as we've known in several societies, that is not the case. Racism is endemic in all societies, and in particular Cuba, because there is no constitutional democracy or constitutional laws or democratic tools to assist these populations to actually have a voice. During the civil rights movement, there was extreme oppression from the Jim Crow South for African Americans. But what we don't focus on is the fact that they had democratic tools of the media, they had democratic tools of free expression that assisted in garnering international support. So Cubans have not only been, their history, Black Cuban history has been erased from the period of the Republic, and which includes the activism and the organizing that Afro-Cubans have had during the Republic period. And so that's super important because when you look at what's happening now with the protests in Cuba, many of these protests, especially starting from San Antonio de los Baños, even San Isidro, where the artistic movement starts, these movements are led by Afro-Cuban youth and Afro-Cuban artists. And again, because of the erasure of race in Cuba, there is not a focus on the fact that they're also combating racial oppression under this regime. And so we have the period of the Republic, which is erased, the societies which were abolished, and you also have the teaching of this history, right? So a part of my research, which I've been presenting on for the last 2 years, of the narrative histories of Cubans in Havana across racial lines, reveals that the curriculum in Cuba is based on a centralized system that's focused on indoctrination. So if teachers and Cuban students want to engage in any kind of social critique related to the Cuban regime, they would be marked and they would not be any longer able to engage in university.
You can take it off.
Oh,
In university.
thanks.
You sure? Okay, good.
She wore her lipstick, so she wants to show it off.
I know.
Okay.
Now I feel like it's all smeared on my face. So, so this important period is the Republic period has been erased from current Cuban contemporary history. And so I think it's very important that we contextualize that Cubans are fighting for freedom of education, freedom of learning their history, freedom of expression, freedom of arts, and engaging in the international community, which has been blocked by the Cuban government because of their use of censoring what's on the internet and actually creating blackouts when Cubans are on the street. And so again, these Cubans are fighting against the repressive system, the history of erasure of Afro-Cubans and Cubans along racial lines, women as well, and the indoctrination of the Cuban education system.
Thank you. So, back to something Odette said at the beginning, the myth of a raceless Cuba. In Cuba, you may have heard, todos somos cubanos. So, but, and then Odette, you also mentioned that, after the revolution, there may have been, or perceptions of improvements in health, abolition of illiteracy, employment for all. And the global, the left in the United States has said, mira, Cuba is a miracle. Everybody's great. Could you share your perspectives on, what is the position, if what is the position of the global left as to the situation in Cuba? Are they still holding up Cuba as paradise, despite what you both have said about, the myth of a raceless, wonderful Cuba?
Yeah, well, this is a great question, which actually will expand to all political polarities. So the thing is, first, I have also something to add to continue with this racial problematics. And I agree absolutely with what Amalia has been said, with the only nuance that this erasure of Black history has been constant, and erasure of Black, more than history, agency in Cuban society and in the production of Cuban history, something that has been consistent in the Cuban existence, let's say, since the 19th century. And so that's why I always want to go back to history. And at the same time that I expanded my this idea of the erasure or the invisibilization of Cuban agency within Cuban lives. And I want to say Cuban life because it's inside and outside of the island. Then also the right, I'm sorry, the left, as you are asking me, but also the right. And I believe that what is happening right now in Cuba, this protest that started in July 11th, but are being continued until today, and we don't know what is going to happen in the next days, actually. They offer us an incredible opportunity to think not only Cuban reality, but all realities beyond simple binary thinking, the right and the left. And especially because Cuban reality from any side, from any reality we are analyzing, is extremely complex. So what's happening with Cuba, especially, yes, you're right, the left, but also the right, is the political tokenization of Cuba. How is it used? The Cuban, because between those both imaginaries, the imaginary from the left, and it's true, the Cuban Revolution at the very beginning, it opened the idea, the belief that utopia might maybe be possible. And it was true. My parents, they thought that we were building the schools and the hospitals and everything and the buildings for their children, my generation. And the problem is that this is very important to understand in Cuba, those unkept promises. So it's true, it was untenable, no? But so at that moment, the left, of course, they thought something was possible, but they have kept this imagination. So they have kept Cuba as this abstract image, this abstract symbol of something they are projecting, they want, because everybody in the world needs hope, and they hope that what they are fighting for is possible. Cuba proved that. But on the other side, then we have the right, and the right is also using Cuba as for their own political manipulations. And in the middle is the actual Cuban people that is not expressed neither through the discourses from the right or the left. So what I would invite both the right and the left, and maybe they won't be able, but everybody, is to think beyond those polarities and try to go through, to finally, what happened during the summer is that we were finally able to listen to the actual Cuban people without political propaganda from one side or the other. So if we listen to them, maybe if another future is possible, not only for Cuba, but for any other society, I would say.
Thank you. So Amalia, have you listened to the Cuban people from inside, especially maybe with a focus on education?
Well, actually, I have. So my research participants who were focused in Havana, there were 73% of African descent. And when I talked to them about the educational system, they shared that they felt as if it was a Russian style education system, that they heard from their parents who had lived in the Republic period that the liberal education system was actually very solid in relation to what their parents were learning and what they were being taught in schools. So the fact that the revolutionary government has a very centralized education system where everything is under the Ministry of Education, makes it so that Cubans, when they enter education, can't study like at Penn. They can't study sociology. They can't study economics in a way that's critical in any way, shape, or form. What's also really important to understand, and my participants shared, is that there was this horizontality of the Russian-style education system in Cuba, that there is no room for verticality. This is based on research participants. They also mentioned that there is no funding that's transparent. They talked about how the Cuban economic system is funded by two major companies, Gaesa and CIMEX, which fund the revolutionary forces that are militarized and the police state. And so the police state is actually running every single education system, every single social society that's being funded by these two corporations, Gaesa and CIMEX. And so it's very important to understand when we're thinking about the Cuban economy and how we don't know. That's one thing that was really fascinating for me when I studied Cuba, is that there's no transparent data that you can rely on coming out of the Cuban government. You have to rely on civic societies and people outside and researchers outside of Cuba to learn from piecemeal research what's really happening from inside, because it's like a prison society. It's such a closed society. It doesn't allow data to be released. And so this was very important. My participants shared this because out of the few Afro-Cubans that were able to go into higher education in my data set, they had to align with the communist ideology. And they felt that they were indoctrinated and they weren't a part of an open system that could critique and move the society forward. And so again, this is coming from research, ethnographic data, and my participants really sharing how difficult it was for them to access university if they were religious, for example, if they had family abroad. So these very abstract and illogical forms of admitting students to college were applied to Cubans, and typically Afro-Cubans were imprisoned at higher rates. So if you were in prison, if you challenged the state in any way, you were not able to go to university. And it's interesting, the Cuban education system, there's university and there's pre. And sometimes their data say pre is university, but as we know, Cubans, it's a complicated system, but Cubans between the ages of 15 and 17 are in pre. And so it's not necessarily like a community college. And sometimes there's some research that aligns with community college, but it's not. The university system is highly segregated. I had a participant who actually worked in University of Havana who shared that there were very little Afro-Cubans in the university positions. And so not only in the faculty, the students, I had a medical student who said he was a mulatto Cuban, who said he was one of the only Afro-Cubans in his class. And this was in 2018. And so there's so much that we don't know. We need transparent data. We need to have a society that allows for the internal community to be able to have a voice in how they're governed. And so that's very important as well. And that's one of the reasons why the protests are happening. There's students right now who are facing jail time simply for saying libertad.
Thank you. So let me pick up on a couple of words. So Odette, you use the word binary, the left and the right, and maybe it's things are more complicated. And Amalia, you said that the few Afro-Cubans that you met, they're few. But just for shits and giggles, just to play the left, do you think that there are even though there are not too many Afro-Cubans in university? Leading question.
Yeah.
Don't you think that there are more now than there were before, just to be binary? I mean,
Well,
how many Black Cubans were in the university during the time of Batista?
actually,
And, so just
And,
talk
yeah,
to us a bit,
and
both of you.
between the 1940s and 50s, the University of Havana had 11% Afro-Cubans as students. Okay, this is based on historical data that's in text. Another part of this is that we are looking at Cuba from hindsight, right? This is 2021. All societies had racist structures, and at this point, I would argue that the populations of 70% of Cubans of African descent. So you're going to have a particular amount of Cubans in the system that are of African descent. But the issue is university isn't like university as we understand it as open thinking and thinking in a way that's critical and sound. It is, if you are coming through the system, you cannot critique the government or we will close your thesis and dissertation and you will be marked and surveilled by the intelligence. So that is the other key. What are you learning? How is this learning, if it's free, a part of an open society that can actually develop in a way that the people want it to develop?
Again, anything you want to add?
Yes.
And if you could speak louder so that our Zoom participants can hear. Just speak a little
Yes,
louder.
I'm sorry. Yes, well, I am actually very touched for that because I studied in Cuba. I went to university, so I studied on my undergraduate. So I studied at the University of Havana, and yes, it's true. There is a minority of Cubans, of Black Cubans, and higher education. This is something that we cannot so it's true. But at the same time, I appreciate what this historical perspective, in the sense that, well, this is higher education, but at the same time, when I was a kid in Cuba, so just elementary education, there, I would say, well, everybody, so before the revolution, they didn't, and I wasn't there, so I am not that old. But we have to measure. That's why it's so complex. We cannot see interpret it between black and white. But this is one thing. The other, which I totally agree with Amalia, is of course the indoctrination. So how we received in Cuba, and I think that in my time it was worse than in the present. How it was completely a socialist education. Our coursework was, and our books came from the former Soviet Union, or at least from the Soviet bloc. So this is true. But and it's true as well that today Cuban dissidents are being, of course, yes, and they are being repressed, and this is something that I am really extremely sad about that. About the government response to the protest, because I was expecting for dialogue. And I think that this dialogue has to happen within the Cuban situation. I was expecting the Cuban government to answer differently to the protesters, and it didn't happen. So this is very, very complicated. It demands from us to activate our humanness more than the strict and rigid political stances.
So on that point, activate our humanity, our humanness. Let me ask you the last question, and then we'll open up to the Zoom participants or those here in the class, in the classroom. So what suggestions do you have for those of us outside of Cuba, for the Cuban diaspora? What can we do in addition to activating our humanism? Is there anything that we can do? So Amalia and then Odette.
Absolutely. So right now in the Philadelphia community, there are Cuban Americans coming together, and because I'm a part of the co-organizing, there is going to be a march and a protest on Sunday at People's Plaza. And this is a mirror march of what's happening in Cuba on the 15th of November. So the civic societies have come together to let the Cuban government know that they want to peacefully protest. And the Cuban government has responded with repression and with violence. And so the people are going to march anyways. And so there's 96 cities globally right now that are registering a march and a protest for November 14th and November 15th. And ours is going to be in People's Plaza at 1 o'clock on Sunday.
Yes, well,
What can we do?
Beyond listen to the Cuban people on the island, I would say that, and this is larger than us, so we cannot understand Cuba also without the impact of the US embargo since the 1960s. And I'm talking as a Cuban that was living in Cuba, who has family in Cuba, and who experienced the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, so what is known as a special period in Cuba. So from experience, I would say it is not helping. So the economic restrictions on Cuba they are not really helping to improve, that they are not improving Cuban lives. What they are asking the Cubans on the street is an improvement of their lives. Also, freedom, also, or I would say more than this is another thing, this is not monolithic. The protest in Cuba is not, the protesters in Cuba, they are not following only one set of demands. And there is everything. There is, yes, there is the change, the need of a political reform, this is clear, but also they need to improve their lives, and the embargo is not helping. And furthermore, I think that the embargo sometimes is helping to maintain the situation that we have right now, because each time that the government wants to justify any erratic, because those are erratic economic or political measures, they use the embargo as a justification. If the embargo disappears, can you imagine that the Cuban government has no more arguments to justify their politics, and they will have to face themselves in the middle, and probably they will have to negotiate with the Cuban people, and they also have to listen to the Cuban people, so it's not only us.
So thank you, Amalia and Odette, for bringing us up to date. Social inequalities, race persecution, discrimination, and the inequalities play out in the education system. One thing to do is listen to what the people who are living the experience are saying, raise our awareness by coming to panels like this, and go to marches, and let's see if maybe that has an impact in Cuba. So now I'm going to open it up to you all if you have any comments or questions, but we already have a comment from someone on the Zoom call, and she wants to know, one of you used the word second revolution. Could you please explain what you mean by the second revolution?
It was the title of the panel was called that, but we didn't. I would not refer.
Well, Odette, you sort of, we began. There was a first revolution, getting rid of the Spanish yoke of colonialism. Then there was, as you mentioned, Odette, in the 1902, the establishment of La República de Cuba. Then there was another revolution overthrowing Batista and establishing Machado. So there's been a number of protests or revolutions, but there you go.
Yeah.
Hadassah, I hope that answered your question. Any comments or questions from you all? Tell us your name and who you are. And
speak very loudly. You almost have to yell for people to hear you on Zoom. It will feel unnatural, but do it anyway.
the microphone is here, and that's why I'm talking so loud. And I can repeat it if we can't. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Sarah Plana. Thank you so much for being here. I'm the postdoctoral fellow here, and I'm the Cuban American as well. So I really appreciate this discussion. So I'm curious what you think the prospects are for the government to change its approach to the protest and in general to achieve the protesters' vision. And do you see any opportunities? And are there prospects for actual change? If so, what sort of change?
Sarah, a postdoc from Perry Woldhouse, wants to know: do you think the government's going to change?
Yeah, and I think if we look at the history of the Cuban government and international pressure when they're being repressive. So between 1965 and 67, the Cuban government arrested 30,000 people that were political dissidents and put them in labor concentration camps called UMAP. It ended in 1967 because of international pressure to close these concentration and labor camps that were putting in prison homosexuals, political dissidents, anyone who had anything to say about the Cuban Revolution in the 1960s were thrown into these concentration labor camps, 30,000 of them. So international pressure pushed the Cuban government to close them down. We ended up doing something else, turning their island into prisons, actually. They created about 200 prisons between 1959 to present. So engaging in activism in social media, hashtag SOS Cuba, hashtag 15N Cuba. These hashtags in the beginning of July 11th, about 20 million tweets went out, and we are moving some policy, some of Biden administration's policy forward. I've been on Capitol Hill. I've met with some of Congress members. I met with the Congressional Black Caucus, and I've been having conversations with our politicians and political leaders related to continuing sanctions on Cuba, because we cannot fund repression. We cannot fund a police state that has no transparency and that continues to oppress its people.
Is there anything you want to add?
Yes, well, I am against the sanctions. I cannot follow that because when I see my people suffering, I cannot agree with the sanctions. But this is another thing. So answering your questions, I believe I am not extremely optimistic on that tone, but I would say that the Cuban government absolutely needs to change the Cuban system. Right now, it is not a socialist revolution that we imagined that existed at the beginning of the 1960s. So it's more a bureaucratic state capitalism structure, and they have to change that. They don't have to change not the name, but they have to change the structure. They have to change the ways in which the power has been kept through decades into the same people. And they also, I think that the monopartyism, so the fact that there is only one party, the Communist Party, that is in power, this has to change. They have to include political diversity within the government. And they have to establish a dialogue. Is it possible? Are they doing this? Unfortunately, the latest news from Cuba don't show that they don't have any intention to keep the dialogue. But still, I think that in Cuba there is a potential because inside, not outside. I think that there is many very well qualified and lucid Cubans, maybe not in the government, but scholars and activists and intellectuals that can help to save Cuban society today. But they have to be able to express themselves and be heard.
So thank you. So change from the inside and pressure from the outside might result in the Cuban government changing, making lives of people better. Take it away.
So can you all hear me? Can everyone hear me? Okay, I'm just going to almost shout. So both of you have talked about the erasure of Blackness in Cuba, African ancestry, and that this in some ways was very deliberate at the time of the revolution. I'm curious, and you've also pointed out that many of the people who are leading protests today are students of African descent in Cuba who obviously are paying a very high price for their activism. So I'm wondering, I have kind of a two-part question. The first is, how has the Afro-Cuban population maintained its connection under a system that tried to erase it? And what is that connection externally with an African diaspora more globally?
Sure. And I would begin with thinking through the religious and spiritual components of Afro-Cubans and Cuban society largely, also through the arts and through music. So between the 1940s and 50s, there was a renaissance in Cuba called Afrocubanismo, which was focused on the music, the nationalizing of Afro-Cuban religions, and also its connections to the Harlem Renaissance. So during the Republic period, there was relationships between Afro-Cubans and African Americans. And actually a Tuskegee student was one of the architects for Club Atenas, which was a Black society. And so it's important to remember that Afro-Cubans have a strong history during the colonial period. Again, the 526 Afro-Cuban societies that were erased during the revolution that now are present in some arts, some religious affiliations at this point, but all religious affiliations like the Yoruba committee, that's under the Communist Party. And Yorubas are not aligned politically. And so even Cuban religions that are clandestine in Cuba, their nationalization contradicts the purpose of of how they were rooted and how they were birthed in in Cuba. And I say this as the daughter of two Yoruba Ifarisha Santeros. And so I know the repression of Afro-Cuban religions in Cuba because my father was one. And he, was a political dissident as well because he couldn't practice his religion until the 1980s, which is when we became refugees. And so Afro-Cubans continue to practice their religion in a way that is aligned to their roots and in their homes, in their neighborhoods, in marginalized communities, but they don't have any representation that is not aligned with the regime. And as far as representation in the system, as an organization, as a recognized organization.
So keeping alive the roots of the from Yoruba Lukumi, Nigeria, West Africa, who came in the 1800s, is one way that Cubans who are of African descent have maintained the culture despite the government trying to repress. Did you want to add anything
Yes,
to that?
and actually, I would say that inspired that the Afro-Cuban clubs, they were eradicated in the 1960s in Cuba. There was still, I would say, alternative ways in which Black Cubans had kept their certain kind of solidarity. And we don't have to go to in this case, I'm coming to the present. I know and I was the one that was going always back in history, but I am thinking in the 1990s, a place like in Havana del Este, east of Havana, and which is marginalized side of Cuba, of Havana. And this is where Cuban hip hop was born in the 1990s. And they have, during the 1990s, and this is something I experienced as well, so I get that experience here about that experience. And they have, during the 1990s, the festival, the hip hop. And this is not, it wasn't supported by the government. Actually, when the government arrived and trying to co-opt their work, this is the moment in which Afro-Cuban or Cuban hip hop started to fall into decay. But before the arrival of the government and they created what is called the Agencia Cubana del Rap. Before they institutionalized these expressions, African American hip hop groups went to Cuba regularly, and they went to Alamar, they went to Havana del Este, to what was known the festival, the hip hop, the Cuban hip hop. And those were, so we have, when we are talking about Afro-Cuban resilience, yes, we are resilient. And yes, it's happening. So unfortunately, until the 1990s, Afro-Cuban religions weren't allowed to be practiced in public. But since the 1990s, it is possible. So it is a difficult game, which I agree totally with Amalia in the role of this, I don't remember, la Asociación Yoruba de Cuba, etc. But this is not really representing the whole Afro-Cuban population. And also another thing, la Asociación Yoruba de Cuba is not black, it's not just dedicated to Afro-Cubans, it's for all Cubans. So there also something to take into account.
And I don't think we can talk about hip hop without talking about the rappers that are political prisoners right now. Michael Osorbo, who sewed his mouth shut and went on hunger strikes. We're talking about the El Funky, who was in prison and now is in exile. And we're talking about the Patria Vida musicians who created the anthem for the protests to cling to as hope. And so these are Afro-Cuban musicians, artists, and raperos that are still in prison, especially Michael Osorbo. We don't even know how he's doing. And so I don't think we can mention Cuban hip hop and the strength of the Afro-Cuban musicians without recognizing that when they are critiquing the government, which hip hop is a part of. I grew up in 1980 hip hop in upstate New York. Hip hop is contestatory. If it cannot be contestatory in Cuba, and if you are imprisoning your rap artist, that is not a good example of talking about the strengths of Afro-Cuban hip hop artists because it's being repressed. Odette, it's being repressed.
We have to
Currently.
be nuanced as well, because Cuban hip hop in the 1990s was extremely contestatory. You only have to go back and to read or to go to YouTube and see their
Yeah, and it was taken over. It was
extremely-
taken over by the government and whitened.
But still, they were
Okay.
able to do that.
And
And
right
also
now-
concerning the Patria Vida song, we have to remember who were those musicians, those that were in Cuba. I agree, but it's not that monolithic. So we have to.
Thank you both. We're running out of time, so we're going to get 2 more questions or comments, and then we'll close up. 1 and then 2. Take it away. Oh, okay, take it away.
Hi, my name is Justin Cosman. I'm actually,
You're gonna have to speak
Oh.
much louder.
hi, Justin Cosman. I'm actually a vet student, but Cuban American. And my question was on seeing all the videos come out of Cuba over July. There are also some videos that people would use as, not bait, but like support for their pro-communist or pro-Cuba talking points that showed like pro-Fidel marches and pro-communist marches. And I was curious as to how you would approach talking to people who use that as a support to be like, look, like this is the people that think the majority of people actually still want the system, and B, how to work with people to like move in their minds like the indoctrination that was forced upon them.
No, go ahead.
So in Cuba, there is a history of these things called actos de repudio, which are repudiation acts. So the Cuban government would rally the neighborhood and say, there are people who are trying to leave. For example, the Mariel refugees are trying to leave, or there's going to be Las Damas de Blanco, which is a group of political dissidents who are going to walk the streets of Havana in white with a flower. You need to attack them. You need to attack them. And these groups of people, these same groups of people that are used to repudiate acts of expression and freedom, are groups that the Cuban government also brings together to say you have to protest. I was actually in Cuba in 2018 through a university program where they, through the People to People University program, they required us to attend the May 1st labor march. So it was like at 5 o'clock in the morning, we had to be there with Cuban people. And I'm like, why do we have to be a part of it? Because they wanted for Americans to look at how many Cubans are out, out supporting the Labor Day movement. But when you talk to them, they were all forced to be out on the street. So I actually witnessed how it's not by choice. And if you don't do what they tell you to do, then they harm your family, they harm your children, they harm people who are your closest loved ones. It has divided families, not only because of migration, over 3 million Cubans have migrated Cuba since 1959. This did not happen prior to 1959. And it has divided families and harmed so much of the family unit. So that is the repression. The repression forces are also tied into seeing these protesters that gather to support the government, these pro-government protesters.
The last one, because we need to go. Go ahead.
It's curious for me about how the government in Cuba, once an association show up in the society, like a religious society, for example, there isn't a religious society there was since the Republic, named La Casa de la Letra del Año, that a group of religious people went there and do religious activities. So in the 92, the government of Cuba created the Asociación Cultural Yoruba de Cuba.
Yes, it's across the capital.
And the objective of that association was replace the original one, and they did it actually. So with their Agencia Cubana del Rap happened the same. That movement show up like a flower in nowhere. And the government created the Agencia Cubana del Rap
To
to
replace.
replace that.
Right.
So I
Yes.
want to know.
So, yeah,
No,
we've heard
I
about
agree
this.
with that. I agree absolutely with that. This is what happened. They kill all the creativity, but at the same time, when you can, so I believe that the creation of this La Casa Cultural Yoruba wasn't enough to kill the whole, to eradicate the whole networks of, so I think there are two letters in Anion, so there are still
There
two.
was. Now
Oh,
there
there
is
was?
one. Yes.
No,
They
well,
were
well, maybe you're right. I am
No,
not
no.
discussing this because I am not, well, I receive two every year. But anyways, Luna is the one that is the authentic one. They put it like that, by the way, even in Facebook. They say, this is the authentic one, and the authentic one is not the official one. And then the other one, that is the governmental one. So why I bring this into discussion is to say that, yes, they do all that, but at the same time, there is other forces that remain somehow uncontrolled. So people are still culturally, politically, and also economically, or the informal economy is also somehow undermining this total control of the government over the society.
So thank you all. Social inequalities, racial tamping down, bad educational system, propaganda, replacement of the original with the false. Thank you all for being here to raise our awareness of what's been going on and what we can do to pressure our government, to pressure that government for change. So Professor Amalia Lache, Professor Odette Casamayor Cisnero, thank you very much. Theo and LaShawn, thank you for doing this.
And
Last word.
I want to give the panel a round of applause. For we're yelling because we've actually gotten a ton of complaints over Zoom that they couldn't hear us properly. And so I just want to say again, thanks very much to Odette Amalia and Fernando for an exciting conversation. Fernando really did a wrap up, but I want to always add my own wrap up, which is that my takeaway message from this panel is in part that the world is complex and understanding what's happening in Cuba requires a deeper analysis, first thing. Issues of race are central to issues of justice. And though there's been some attempt to raise issues of race in Cuba, it hasn't worked, it shouldn't work. And artistry and art matter to change. Many times the people who are in the front lines of change are in fact artists in Cuba, teachers and students in Cuba, and that we should remember that as we think about the different ways that change happen and who's genuinely and truly on the front line. So I want to thank you all. I thank you all for coming out today. I just wanted to say that we hope to see you back here next week for our program that's going to focus on COP26 and the road ahead. We will have some experts in the room who are at COP. It's wrapping up at the end of this week. As always, for those of you online and in the room, you can access this program and others on our YouTube channel, and you can find out about coming events by joining our mailing list and social media. We have dropped links into the chat that you can register for. And until we see you next week, be well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.